Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Charleston Festival. I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Lara Feigel and David Boyd Haycock, and as a very special extra surprise and bonus, Virginia Nicholson, who's chairing this event. Lara's a lecturer at King's College, London, where she specialises in the 1930s and the Second World War. She's written on the cinema during this period and is the co-editor of the journals of Stephen Spender, who visited Charleston on several occasions and appeared at the festival shortly before his death. Her current book, The Love Charm of Bombs, is the biography of 5 literary figures in war-torn London. David Haycock's current book is I Am Spain. The subject is the British and American writers who went to Spain during the Civil War, either to fight for the Republic or to report on the conflict. It's a subject very close to the heart of Charleston, as Julian Bell, the son of Vanessa Bell, who was brought up here, was killed while driving an ambulance for the Republican cause in Spain. David's previous book, A Crisis of Brilliance, told the story of 5 young British artists during the Great War. And I'm really pleased to say, and to let you all know, if you haven't picked up any material, that book is now going to result in an exhibition of those artists, Nash, Nevinson, Spencer, Gertler and Carrington and Bomberg, at the Dulwich Picture Gallery this coming June the 12th until September the 22nd. So, something that's very compatible with Charleston. Virginia Nicholson is the daughter of Quentin and Anne Olivia Bell and the niece of Julian Bell, the uncle she never knew. She spent a great deal of her childhood at Charleston. Her books include Millions Like Us, Women's Lives in the Second World War, Singled Out, How Women Managed Without Men in World War II, and Among the Bohemians. So the format will be that David will talk, followed by Lara, and then they'll have a conversation with Virginia, and we'll welcome some questions from the audience. So I'll hand over to David Boyd Haycock.
Thank you and good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was here 3 years ago with my last book, as Diana said, A Crisis of Brilliance, and I was keen to come back with this book, I Am Spain, because of the connection with Julian Bell. He doesn't make an enormous appearance in my book, partly for the reason that he was sadly only in Spain for 6 weeks before he was killed in the Battle of Brunetti in 1937, aged only 29. What I wanted to do with the book was to start in a way by writing a sequel to A Crisis of Brilliance. Crisis of Brilliance about 5 artists and using their memoirs, their letters, their diaries, the recollections of their friends and teachers to tell their story in a historical way, using primary evidence like that, but writing it almost as if it was a novel, and using characterization, place, plot, pace, the sort of things I'd tried to achieve in my own failed novel writing career, and never being able to find the sort of the plot that I wanted to write or the characters I wanted to write about. And it worked very well and was very nicely reviewed. And it seemed like a chance to step forward and beyond that with a new book that would use the same techniques, but look at a time and a place, a step forward, a step ahead from the First World War that marked the climax of A Crisis of Brilliance, and to see the world that existed after the Great War. Crisis of Brilliance ends really in 1919 with the Great War as a bitter and difficult experience that has changed the world forever. And the momentous nature of that war can never really be fully understood now. And in a way, the war of 1936 to 1939, the Spanish Civil War, can't be understood because it is such a different world. But I wanted to try and give some sense of that war, seen through the contemporary eyes of men and women, the famous names like George Orwell and Ernest Hemingway, but also some of the lesser-known people, Esmond Romilly, John Cornford, the great-grandson of Charles Darwin, who went out at the very start of the war, Alva Bessie, an American communist. It was also done from the point of view of the Republican side. These were all Republican supporters. And I'm sort of apologetic for that. It's a very two-sided war. And it's a war that's often seen as being too much understood or visualized through the experience of the literary types who went, the Stephen Spenders, the Audens, as well as the Hemingways and the Orwells. And my book replicates that, but I want it to also give a sense of the reason for going, the reason that these people were there. The way in which it's a sequel to A Crisis of Brilliance is that the inspiration came partly from the fact that so many people wanted to go out to Spain in the 1920s and the 1930s, from Britain particularly, but also from America. And artists went there. The artists I wrote about, people like Mark Gertler, Paul Nash, David Bomberg, Dora Carrington, all went out to Spain in the 20s and 30s. And I'm just going to open with the opening passage from the book to give a sense of why they were going, what Spain was like. Spain in 1936 was a land not well known to many foreigners. W.H. Auden memorably described it as that arid square, that fragment nipped off from hot Africa, soldered so crudely to inventive Europe. To George Orwell, writing of how he pictured Spain before he first travelled there, it was a land of white sierras and Moorish palaces, of goat herds and olive trees and lemon groves, of gypsies and girls in black mantillas, bullfights, cardinals, and the half-forgotten terrors of the Inquisition. Of all of Europe, he would write in 1937, Spain was the one country that had the most hold upon his imagination. But Spain was not simply a land of the imagination, of course. In the years immediately around the Great War, a number of British and American writers and artists travelled and even settled there. Their books and paintings added layers of modernity to Orwell's almost oriental vision. Yet they too sometimes mirrored his exotic impression, for Spain was a land not quite like anywhere else in Western Europe. The American novelist John Dos Passos first visited Spain in 1916, a few months after he'd graduated from Harvard. He had travelled already in France, Italy and Greece, yet wrote that nowhere else in Europe had he so felt the strata of civilization. Celt-Iberians, he wrote, Romans, Moors and French have each passed through Spain and left something there alive. It's the most wonderful jumble, the peaceful Roman world, the sadness of the Semitic nations, their mysticism, the grace, a little provincialized, a little barbarized, of a Greek colony, the sensuous dream of Moorish Spain, and little yellow trains and American automobiles and German locomotives all in a tangle together. When the author Lytton Strachey visited Granada in the spring of 1920, he too was captivated. Never have I seen a country on so vast a scale, he wrote home. Wild, violent, spectacular. Enormous mountains, desperate chasms, endless distances. Colours everywhere of deep orange and brilliant green. A wonderful place, but easier to get to with a finger on the map than in reality. Strachey's travelling companion, the artist Dora Carrington, would be equally moved, capturing the landscape and its people in scintillating oil colours. She would be one of the first in a long line of post-war British artists to visit Spain. Ben and William Nicholson, Augustus John, David Bomberg, Mark Gertler, Henry Moore, Edward Burrough, to name only the most well-known. And there were English-speaking writers too, making of Spain a place to wander. Ralph Bates, Waldo Frank, Robert Graves, Ernest Hemingway, Laurie Lee, Malcolm Lowry, V.S. Pritchett, as well as Dos Passos. According to one contemporary literary critic, what had initially attracted Dos Passos, and no doubt some of the others too, was the discovery in Spain of what they quoted as an attitude toward life and a way of living which are in pleasant contrast to the mad turmoil of industrial Europe and America. And it was that difference, that kind of vision of Spain as a country that was different from anywhere else quite, that was in Europe, that was backward, that was in need of change and wanted change. It hadn't participated in the First World War. And in that respect, it seemed like a place of rest and escape. Gerald Brennan, who Dora Carrington would fall in love with, he settled in Spain in 1919 to write and would spend much of his life there writing about Spain. He wouldn't get involved in the Spanish Civil War. But when the war did break out in 1936, it would become an ideological battlefield of left against right, of a place where the world, it seemed, could be changed, that a battle was taking place for civilization. Both sides saw it as a battle for civilization, that communism on one side was going to destroy the world, or fascism on the other side was going to destroy the world. Of course, if you're a communist, communism was going to save the world. If you're a fascist, fascism was going to save the world. And that was the ideological division and the opportunity to try and do something for the world. And that's what drove Julian Bell there and others like him. Many of them sacrificed their lives for a country they knew very little about, really. But it's that ideological battle, the place in which perhaps a Second World War could be prevented, the sense that here was a chance to fight for something. And yet many of these young people, Orwell particularly, John Cornford, have been pacifists. And I was fascinated by what made them move from being pacifists against war in any form to actually going out and fighting a war. And coming here and walking on the downs here and thinking of Julian Bell going through all those issues in his mind of his responsibility to his family, to his mother Vanessa, who just did not want him to go, to his father Clive Bell, who was an absolute committed pacifist, and even after his son had died in Spain, wrote that a Europe controlled by the Nazis was less bad than Europe engulfed in another war. And that fear, the fear of war that runs through Britain and Europe and America in the 1920s and the 1930s is something that is incredibly, it creates the whole intellectual atmosphere. And that is what Lara is going to lead us into the war of 1939, the war that people hoped that they would be able to stop by fighting for either side, perhaps, in Spain. And a war that seems now very long ago. But I just want to sort of end on a personal note, because I was born in 1968, and when I go back to thinking of this war in the 1930s, I think, oh well, that's so long ago. It was a war that had nothing to do with me and my generation. But to go back that many years from today takes us back to 1984, and that suddenly doesn't seem really so very long ago. A year that was dominated, as I remember well, with George Orwell and his famous book that owed a great deal to his time in Spain. But also if I go back to 1939, the year that the war in Spain ended and the Second World War began, it was a momentous year in my personal life because it was the year that my father was born. He was actually born on the day that Barcelona was taken by Franco's army. And he would grow up in a London dominated by bombs. George Orwell said, we have to fight to stop this that's happening in Spain, happening in England and happening in London. Guernica, the great image of the Spanish Civil War, of that coming to London. And my father was bombed, his house was bombed in 1940. There was a famous poster from the Spanish Civil War, a dead Barcelona child, and the legend underneath, if you tolerate this, your children will be next. And my father was nearly one of those children. His house was obliterated. The street he was born in and lived in for the first 2 years of his life is no longer there. And I think that leads us in perfectly to what Lara is now going to talk to you about her book. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And yes, it does lead in very well. My book is a group biography of 5 writers in primarily London in the Second World War and afterwards. And 4 of the 5 had jobs in the civil defence services. So it follows on, I think, from both of David's books in the sense of exploring artists of one kind or another at war, and particularly in this case, mobilised writers who had a job defending their city. So Elizabeth Bowen and Graham Greene were both ARP wardens. Henry Greene, whose actual name was Henry York, was a fireman. Rose Macaulay was an ambulance driver. And then the 5th writer is sort of the odd one out. She's a woman called Hilda Steele, who was an Austrian exile in London, who I sort of included to give, I suppose, an alternative perspective on this period, in the sense that a kind of reminder that the often very exciting times lived by the other writers were sort of privileged and unusual. So the argument of the book, in part, is that the Second World War, although awful and gruelling, could produce a sort of exhilaration and intensity that certainly, for this very unusual group of writers, was unrivaled in the rest of their lives. And they all look back on it as some of them as producing the most awful experiences of their lives, but also some of the most intense, often in a good way, experiences, which sort of, I think, seems quite surprising to us now. And I know there are a couple of people here who've been in the war, and I don't know if people had those experiences or not. I think a lot didn't. So I'm just going to read a page from the beginning of the book, and then I'm going to take you through a particular night of the Blitz that I've sort of reconstructed in my first 4 chapters, hour by hour. So starting with a quick reading. The Second World War was a total war. No one escaped the danger, and every Londoner was vulnerable. While the fighting in the First World War took place far away, the bombing of the Second World War was superimposed onto a relatively normal London life. Books were written, parties hosted, love affairs initiated and broken off. But the books, parties and love affairs were infused with the danger of death. Every aspect of life was refracted through the lens of war. Looking back on the Blitz, Elizabeth Bowen described this as a period of lucid abnormality, a moment outside time when she and her friends were afloat on the tideless, hypnotic, futureless today. When a bomb exploded, nearby clocks ceased to function, remaining stuck at the time of the detonation. London was a city of shock-stopped clocks, and for its inhabitants, the suspended present created a climate where intense emotions could flourish. It came to be rumoured, Bowen recalled, that everybody in London was in love. Bowen, Greene, Macaulay, Steele and York floated dangerously on that futureless present. All experienced the war as an abnormal pocket of time. As writers, they observed the strangeness of war imaginatively. London became a city of restless dreams and hallucinogenic madness, a place in which fear itself could transmute into addictive euphoria. To stay in London was to gamble nightly with death, and so each day was unexpected, each moment had the exhilarating but unreal intensity of the last moment on earth. Their public war work became the backdrop for volatile individual private lives. For Bowen, wartime, with its makeshifts, shelvings, deferrings, could not have been kinder to romantic love. Bowen, Greene and York spent the war in the kind of love that blazed with the raging intensity of the fires igniting their city. So that's just a little bit from the opening of the book. So now I'm going to take you through briefly the night of the 26th of September 1940. So it's 3 weeks into the Blitz. it's worth bearing in mind that the first year of the war, people right at the start expected the immediate bombing of cities, particularly London, but nothing materialised. So it was known as the phony war, a time of sort of primarily watching the war take place overseas and waiting to see what would happen. And particularly for firemen, it was a great anticlimax that sort of Henry York talked about signing up and expecting his it was a suicide act as far as he was concerned, but yet none of the danger he expected came, and people sort of spat at him on buses because they saw him as shirking his duty. So the Blitz, when it came, I think for certainly some of my writers, was a sort of relief that finally they were doing the job they'd signed up to do. They were part of the war. And I think what's interesting in the light of David's talk about the Spanish Civil War is how for so many of this particular generation who was born too late, as I think Isherwood put it, to fight in the First World War, the Spanish Civil War and then the Second World War came as a sort of needed test. I think the Spanish Civil War, yes, of course, was an ideological battle, but it was also a way to prove themselves in the face of a sort of a heroic generation who'd fought in the First World War and who they felt they could never quite live up to. And that was certainly true, particularly for Graham Greene of my writers, that he spent his youth sort of longing for a way to sort of to prove that he could be brave too. So the 26th of September, they've had 3 weeks of continual nighttime raids. No one quite expected that when the raids did come, they'd last all night. They expected something short and sharp. Shelters weren't really designed for people to spend whole nights in them. So the whole of London is exhausted. No one knows when it's going to end, but yet there's a kind of neighbourliness that we've all heard about, that sense of pulling together, of people finding resources they didn't know they had in the community, and shelter wardens in particular, and sort of ARP wardens are really part of this, that they're sort of pulling together their own communities. So the night begins at 7:30 with a blackout. Everyone's blacking out their windows, and so Elizabeth Bowen goes on duty as an ARP warden in Marylebone, and Graham Greene in Bloomsbury. And their job, first of all, is to make sure that there are no chinks in the blackout along the way, and also to try and usher people into the shelters. Although there's a great resistance to sheltering because it sort of seems just as frightening to be buried in a shelter as to be bombed on the street. So just to introduce the two of them, they're both going around. They're both in uniform with tin hats and sort of uniform overcoats. Starting, I think, with Graham Greene, who's probably the most famous writer of my five. As I've said, he's spent his youth kind of waiting for a test of bravery. He's a manic depressive, and has always sort of relied on danger as a way to feel alive. He spent his childhood playing Russian roulette with a loaded gun, and found that was the way to kind of to get that sense of brief excitement in which you forgot the sort of pointlessness of life. But even that he found got boring because the danger became too sort of predictable. So he's always looking for unusual kinds of danger. And the title of my book, that quite strange phrase, "The Love Charm of Bombs," comes from a quote from an essay that Graham Greene wrote at this time, where he said, "The nightly routine of sirens, barrage, the probing raider, the unmistakable engine, where are you, where are you, where are you? The bomb bursts, moving nearer and then moving away, hold one like a love charm." And for Greene, it particularly was a love charm because he like many men, had used, I suppose, the excuse of the war to sort of quickly evacuate his wife and children. And was rather enjoying sort of suddenly finding himself single in London, and was making the most of it, that he could now spend the night sort of fairly easily with his lover at the time, Dorothy Glover, who was a feisty shelter warden. And so the two of them, Malcolm Muggeridge describes sort of brilliantly, the two of them kind of running around in the dark, looking for danger, tearing up pieces of paper that were sort of falling out of bomb buildings and reading them out, and really enjoying the sort of surreal scenes offered by the Blitz. So that's Graham Greene enjoying the violence. So around the corner, we have Elizabeth Bowen, who's less sort of manically excited by the war, but I think, too, feels that this is the chance for her generation to come into its own. She's the same age as the century, and she talks about her century and herself as sort of coming of age together. She feels that she's part of the current of her time in a way that she's never felt before. And she's sort of wonderfully brave, and she's not kind of, I mean, Graham Greene really used to go out looking for bombs to fall on him, thinking it might be exciting to kind of have that encounter with danger at first hand. Bowen isn't looking for them, but she's finding, I suppose, resources in herself that she didn't know she had. There's a great sort of anecdote told by Stephen Spender about when he and Natasha went for dinner at Bowen's house, which overlooked Regent's Park. They all sat on the balcony as the bombs fell. Sort of Bowen expected them to sit there valiantly, and she said, "Oh, I do apologise for the noise." It's that kind of great English spirit, although she's Anglo-Irish, which is another story of Bowen's war, which I go into in the book, that she was going back to Ireland to report on the situation in Ireland to the British during the war. And Bowen, like Greene, what I talked about in the extract I read, this sense that there's a kind of timelessness in the moment, created by the sense that if you might die tomorrow, you must make the most of today. She too has that sense of the moment and writes about it beautifully in her wartime literature, the moment sort of expanding. And she will fall in love in the spring of 1941 with Charles Ritchie, who's the man she really loved passionately for the rest of her life. And both Greene and Bowen, it's worth adding, had sort of strangely celibate marriages in a way that was quite oddly common at the time. I think that people, I mean, we could talk about this maybe, but people married very young, not quite knowing what they were getting into, and marriage became a sort of family and a kind of a home as much as anything else. And that gave them perhaps a freedom that maybe we find strange today, but not perhaps at Charleston. So that's the two of them, and then racing forward. So the bombs start at 8:30. The siren goes. Their job is to echo the siren on their whistles. Then at 10 o'clock, it's time for Rose Macaulay to go on duty as an ambulance driver and Henry York to go on duty as a fireman. So Henry York, very quickly, like Greene, has made the most of the opportunity to send his wife and child to the countryside. And he is extremely handsome. He's an aristocrat. He's a fireman. And suddenly, from having been spat at in buses, firemen are now the heroes of the day. And there are great stories from women. There was a documentary made much later about Henry Greene, where women sort of look back on loving Greene during the war, and apparently they used to say to each other, "Who are you going out tonight with, darling? Is it someone you'd like to die with?" And luckily, if it was Henry York, then it usually was. So he's having a wonderful time as well. And tonight, his job is to go. This is the first night that the Houses of Parliament are bombed, and his job is to go and help put down the fire there. And there's a dramatic picture, which I include in my book, of the statue of Richard the Lionheart. His sword is bent by the blast. So it's a sort of great symbol of London under fire and sort of slightly bruised, but holding firm nonetheless, much like St. Paul's. So that's Henry York. And then finally, Rose Macaulay, who in some ways, certainly at this stage of the war, is the most kind of troubling and moving figure of the writers I look at. She's the oldest of the writers. She's 58. She's a sort of redoubtable English eccentric. She was always the first to arrive at literary parties and the last to leave, even now. And she, in fact, women weren't allowed to be ambulance drivers if they were over 50, but she, of course, ignored the regulation and managed to get herself accepted, even though the requirement for becoming an ambulance driver was that you had to lift a stretcher with a body on it above your head onto a bunk. And she was tiny and frail and wiry, but somehow this wasn't beyond her. And she was peculiarly suited to ambulance driving because she was an extremely reckless driver. There are tales of her, in the way of these English eccentrics, there are tales of her driving her car round a Hyde Park corner the wrong way and sort of tooting as she went, thinking, why is everyone in my way? So she's that sort of mad English woman. But she, underneath this kind of redoubtable, feisty exterior, she is extremely sad at the moment because for the last 20 years, she's had a very passionate, for her, monogamous relationship with an Irish writer called Gerald O'Donovan. He's been married all along, but really this is the love of, it's the only great love affair of Macaulay's life, and it's for her, it's her marriage effectively, and he is now dying, and of course, in addition to grieving for the imminent loss of her lover of 20 years, there's a terrible thing that she can't tell anyone. What she's upset about. So part of her is sort of throwing herself into ambulance driving as a way to kind of get lost in other people's sadnesses and in the life of her city. And what makes it even worse is that her awful driving was partly responsible for his illness, and that she was driving him around and managed to bang into, I think, an oncoming lorry by going through a red light. And he had a stroke, and that's led to, he had brain injuries which led to a stroke, and that's why he's ill. So she's blaming herself, she's devastated, and she's, the first year of the war, she's been sort of unable to cope at all. But since the Blitz started, she's found as well as sort of strength in herself. So just to give you a quick, she describes this particular night at great length in various letters and articles. So what happens is that she goes to an incident in Camden Town where the ruins of two houses have been flattened, and underneath the ruins there are two families trapped. And so she, as an ambulance driver, is waiting for the people to be rescued by the rescue workers who are digging them out. And she's there all night, and she calls out to the people and tries to get, there's a baby trapped there, and she's trying to get milk to the baby and water to the mother. And they keep saying to them, you'll be out in 5 minutes, it's all right. But in fact, it's something like 10 hours before these people come out. And the people to be rescued are the grandmother and the mother of these children. The mother doesn't want to go in the ambulance with Mcauley because she doesn't want to leave her children behind. And Mcauley promises her that they're about to come out, it will all be fine. But in fact, she knows that they may not be. And it turns out that the next morning, both children are dead. So this is the sort of awful, I mean, it's such a kind of, there's everything in here. There's kind of Graham Greene running around having a wonderful time. There's Mcauley kind of grieving with and having to deal with the sort of the tragedy of these children sort of trapped under the ruins. So that's a quick, I suppose, overview of the kind of the scope of the experiences that people are having in the Blitz, which I suppose relates to the kind of emotional range of the Spanish Civil War as well. So if I pop over.
So thank you both very much for giving those brief edited highlights of what are two really extremely fascinating and rich and textured books. And if you don't mind, I just want to take a very general question to you both to begin with, partly prompted by something that you said, David, which was that you were a sort of frustrated novelist.
Yes.
And I'm fascinated in this because I think perhaps I'm a frustrated novelist, and I like to be held very strongly by the guy ropes of fact, but perhaps as a writer of fiction longing to get out. And I wondered whether that's the case with both of you, but that in you're sort of looking to tell narratives of people in both these books, and that you're in a way telling a stranded multi-biography. I mean, can you comment on that in the context of, as it were, we're looking to do edited highlights as against the cradle-to-grave blockbuster biography here? Is it more that, or is it more social history?
Well, I've always been a biographer, really, even when I was wanting to be a novelist as well. And biography, that's just the personal part of biography was what drew me to it. And being able to tell great stories like the First World War, the Spanish Civil War, through the personal experience, the personal story particularly, and using the individual's words to tell something and weave all that together, that drove me. But also having the sort of sense of the novelist's skill, I suppose, at making a story dramatic and putting a plot together that drives the narrative along was fundamental.
You've done it even more so, Lara, in that you've actually really have gone for the very strongly biographical approach. You're not really telling us about the war, you're telling us about 5 individuals within the war.
And also juxtaposing them, I mean, we kind of, the building up of because they knew each other, but they didn't know each other. There were sort of clever love triangles that linked them in a sort of quite Charlestonish way again, where I think Bowen was jilted by Graham Greene, who then left her for Rosamund Lehrman, who then, jilted by him, had an affair with Henry Green. So there are those sorts of clever links, but there isn't really. They didn't all know each other, and so in a way, it's the novel structure that gives it. And I think I think every group biographer probably has a few novels in their drawer that haven't quite seen publication. And I think for me, the kind of the sort of, in a way, in both reading and writing novels, I always get quite frustrated by plot and think, do we really need it? Because I find people the most, the nuances of, I don't know if this is true as well, of kind of human motivation and emotion are the most interesting thing. And that's, in a way, the nice thing about the sort of the modernist period, that people like Woolf were kind of doing away with plots in the conventional sense. And it's great here being given a plot, and such an extraordinary one as well, and that the task for the biographer is those kind of nuanced emotional things rather than making up of the story. So,
I mean, since you raised it, Lara, I just wanted to quote Mary Wesley, who said, war is very erotic. People had love affairs they would not otherwise have had, and that was a quote I found from her. But it's very evident from what all of your characters experience and what goes through. And I ended up almost thinking, actually, this is a book about adultery. Could you comment on that? Particularly in the context of the times, it is actually quite extraordinary how
much
totally unfaithful these people were.
Which is true of the Spanish Civil War as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
The sort of Hemingway Gellhorn romance is central.
I think people think they can just leave that. If you're going to be dead the next day, you're not going to have to explain your behaviour to your wife when you get home. I mean, Hemingway's shocked when his wife actually does come out to Paris to find him in Spain and find out what he's actually been up to, because she knows that something's going on. But if you think you're going to be dead the next day, I mean, it's not.
I think also I think for my particular group of writers, it's sort of a generational thing that they'd all married young, perhaps not passionately, that they're sort of gaining sexual confidence as they become successful writers at the same time as this war starts, that everything sort of comes together, and this is the time they might die tomorrow, this is the time to have their intense experiences. They're certainly not in marriages where those intense experiences are going to be had at home. And so, yes, adultery seems to be the order of the day. I mean, I think what's interesting is that these aren't, in most cases, brief flings. I mean, Bowen falls in love for life with Charles Ritchie.
It's so fascinating, that love affair, because there's her husband irking quite complacently in the background.
Well, yes, but having said that, I mean, in the 30s, her lover Humphrey House sort of writes a rather sad letter, which I quote, I think, for the first time, saying, oh, why didn't you tell me, Elizabeth, that you were a virgin? There would have been so much less gloom over the breakfast tray. And that was after 10 years of marriage. So I think Alan is responsible for some of the...
I mean, there are some quite extraordinary stories, some of them unrepeatable. I mean, I'm thinking of Henry Yorke's quote about the breakfast. Perhaps I shouldn't go there. But perhaps instead we'll tell a story about Graham Greene, who humiliated his wife at a party in Oxford. Can we go for that one?
I always feel my role is to defend Graham Greene. Isn't that defendable? I mean, the worst thing that Graham Greene did was when he was finally leaving his... I mean, so Graham Greene's affair with Dorothy Glover was sort of his wake-up, that he'd committed to Vivian... He'd committed to a celibate marriage with Vivian. He was pursuing her urgently when they were both 21. She said, actually, I'm not really interested in sex. He said, don't worry, I don't mind. We'll commit to an ideal finer than any marriage. We'll have a celibate marriage. And he realised quite quickly that this hadn't been a very good idea. And with Dorothy Glover, realised that actually sex and love could come together, who didn't need to sort of divide between goddesses and prostitutes. And then after that came the huge affair with Catherine Wollstone that leads to the end of the affair. And when leaving Vivian for Catherine, he sort of quite reasonably says that the marriage is over and that he needs to go, but then adds the awful kind of addendum of, but don't worry, darling, I'll still send you the proofs of my novels to read.
Yes, that made my flesh creep, I must say. Perhaps we shouldn't get into the higher gossip about these people, but it is quite fun, and the book is absolutely punctuated with these kinds of riveting little stories. Let's just try another general question, which is, do you think writers are good at war? Because we tend to think, I mean, you know, the three of us are sitting here, and when we go home and get back to our desks, we're going to be sitting there at our desks being nice sort of peace-loving people. I found myself thinking, what would I be doing if there was a war? And didn't you think that? And you, David? Do we have any right to comment on war? Do writers have any real role in war?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, my brother was a Marine, Royal Marine, for a year, and decided after a year that he didn't fancy the idea of killing people. And I thought, well, have you not read all the books? Have you not, you know, so. What I was talking about with writing I Am Spain is how after the horror of the First World War, and I was absolutely right, some people did think they'd miss out. People like Orwell, he calls us, I felt less of a man of having missed the First World War. And Hemingway wanted to get out to the First World War and got there just in the last stages of it. But so many people who'd missed it and started off, as I said when I was speaking about being pacifists, and then realising that fascism was a thing that had to be fought, then discover what the horror of war is actually like.
Yeah.
And I think that's the writer's the role, even the writer who doesn't go to war and hasn't been to war, which I've never seen or done and would not wish to, because of what I've read firsthand by writers who were in Spain or who were in the First World War, and the way they can convey the brutality, the horror, the discomfort, the pain, the boredom, etc. It amazes me that anyone could ever be want to go and fight.
So there's an element almost of duty, of moral impulse.
Well, yes, so to give some impression over of what what a war is really like, and to give people a sense that it's not something that's going to be wonderful and an enlivening experience. And the Germans, the Nazis, banned certain books like All Quiet on the Western Front for being anti-war, and they banned paintings by First World War writers like Otto Dix, not just for being modernist in a way they hated, but also for displaying war in all its horror and gruesomeness.
But I think I think there's often a tension between perhaps the aesthetics and the political there. That I think all my writers were horrified by war and by what they saw. Mcauley wrote a haunting account of the night I described to you, but they were also kind of slightly guiltily aware that they could turn off at moments and they could think how beautiful London has become. That these kind of the ruins, the surreal spectacles, the sort of the juxtapositions of kind of clothes on trees and houses turned inside out, the bomb sites, the black and white, the kind of the red, the colours. Hemingway Greene is wonderful on that. And this sort of the kind of stretching of time. It's a sort of gift for the novelist, and I think it's no accident that I chose my writers, I suppose, because I think they all wrote their best work as a result of these experiences.
Well,
David, what I was going to ask you was, I think what comes through your book extremely strongly is there's also a third aspect to this, which is that there's an extremely strong romantic impulse as well. And so I was wondering whether there is this need to convey and this need to tell the story of what's going on this important fight between fascism and communism. But at the same time, there's a ramshackle bunch of, sort of hopeless eccentrics who actually are out there for self-realisation and who want to kind of, be a bit macho, have a bit of fun, feel what it's like, have a bit of real life. And quite a lot of them actually come quite clean about that, don't they?
They do, and there is a romantic sense to it.
It's ironic,
and also,
isn't it?
the thrill and the drama. So Hemingway had seen the First World War, but he still wanted to go back, and that's what took him to Spain in the first place in the 1920s, was partly to see the bullfighting and saying it's like being at the front seat of a war. Yeah. And he wanted that, and he wanted to go and find more wars, because he wanted to get that feeling and that thrill and that experience and relive it. It's always astounding that some of the volunteers in the international brigades, Germans, British, French, were veterans of the First World War, and they were prepared to go back and do it again.
And so, but they went out with this sort of wish to find themselves on one level, and then when they got there, it just was absolutely ghastly.
Well,
and
I think the veterans,
and
the Great War veterans, knew what was happening. It was the young, often the young men and women who didn't.
But even amid the ghastly horribleness, I think Martha Gellhorn suddenly looked back on her time with Hemingway in the Spanish Civil War as the high point.
Yes,
probably.
yeah.
And in the Second World War kept saying, why can't it be like Spain? That was my war, I can never get back. I mean, that sort of nostalgia for awful times is sort of quite palpable and quite strange in a way.
Well, there's a wonderful book about the Balkan Wars. I think it's called My War Gone By, I Miss It So.
Isn't it wonderful, something like this happening while we're still alive?
Yeah.
I work in an office, now I'm off to see something real. And they were so young.
Yes.
I mean, not just my uncle, but people like Esmond Romilly, who was a teenager.
Yes. Cycled out to Spain got on his bike and cycled.
Yes, and then went back there with Decca Mitford.
Yes.
Well, she didn't.
And then volunteered for the Second World War as a bomber pilot.
And then died, aged, 21, 2? Yeah. And then John Cornford, of course, who was the great sort of wonderful idealistic
Well, he was
hero.
the sort of the Byronic, yes.
Exactly. I mean, it's
handsome,
the poet, the beauty.
Yes, and idealistic, passioned, but died on 21st birthday.
It's extremely sad at times. I mean, very moving. No wonder it fired the novelist in you. Yeah, and I think Graham Greene had that feeling as well. As you say, this thrill at danger. What does it do to you personally?
Oh yes, and never quite got back. I mean, found the rest of life sort of anticlimactic because he could never quite get to that sense that from that point he was observing danger rather than being part of it. That the writer generally is a witness rather than a participant in.
Actually, it's quite an interesting fact. You're talking about writers sucked into war involuntarily. I mean, the war was just happening around them.
The war was happening around
Whereas
them.
you're talking about writers who go out.
But they
to
chose to be ALP. I mean, Graham Greene had a job in the Ministry of Information by day, so he didn't have to work as an ALP warden. But really, he saw that as his sort of the real war for him. And at one point, he went off to Africa as a spy, but wanted, as soon as he heard London was being bombed, he wanted to come home. So there was a great voluntary sense here, I think, of these were all people. I mean, Mcauley certainly didn't have to be at 58 driving her ambulance, but there was a sense of needing to somehow do something to stop you looking helplessly at a world tearing itself apart.
I was fascinated to find out that Elizabeth Bowen had been a spy.
Yes, I mean, the Irish really see her as a spy. They're sort of great. I was invited to a great for or against Elizabeth Bowen debate in July in Ireland. I'm not sure I see her as quite a spy. She offered her services. In fact, the kind of main quote for this is a letter to Virginia Woolf, written while Virginia Woolf was in Sussex, where Bowen said that she was offering her services to the Ministry of Information because she was so upset by this sort of huge misunderstanding developing between neutral Ireland and England. Churchill wanted to use the Irish seaports as bases to launch ships, and Ireland wouldn't let them, and the English were thinking, gosh, these kind of disloyal and annoying Irish. And Bowen saw that it was, for Ireland at this point in their history, it would have been disastrous, that it would have led to civil war if Lara had tried to take the Irish to war. And so she was really trying, she thought she wasn't spying, she was reporting on one side to the other and trying to create communication, but really has been seen in Ireland, partly because of her difficult position as an Anglo-Irish woman. Anyway, has been seen as a spy, and Sean O'Fwelon, who was one of the people who she'd had an affair with and she was now using him to report on, he sort of gave a great sort of tragic speech saying, I had no idea what Elizabeth was doing and what did she think she was doing. It's sort of the tragedy of her. But really, I think people can sort of overblow her disloyalty. But yes, she was certainly writing secret reports.
David, talk a little bit about the actual. I mean, what comes through again is very strongly is the texture of that war, the chaos, the awful blunders all the time. I mean, to me, that's half the tragedy, is the unnecessary deaths. They were forever, had the wrong cartridges or the wrong ammunition, or, sort of useless guns or lorries turning up in the wrong place at the wrong time. I mean, it was an awful mess and an unnecessary waste of life, wasn't it?
It turned out to be a big mess. Yes, understatement. If I go back to what we were talking at the start about writing non-fiction from the point of a novelist, that I wanted to try and create a sort of a novelist image in that the story starts with optimism and confidence. All these people believing that they can go out and defeat fascism. The book opens virtually with there was a Olympics in Barcelona in 1936, which had been done as an anti-fascist Olympics. Berlin was doing the Olympics in 36. Barcelona had been the city that had just missed out on getting the Olympics for 36, and they held their own version. And all these people coming out with great optimism and hope that they were doing something that was going to change. You know, a sporting event, saying we're doing a signal. This is us, sportsmen, people against fascism, and communism as this positive opportunity for changing the world. An organisation that was one of the only organisations in Europe that was fighting ideologically against the rise of fascism. And then the way that slowly breaks down through the course of the war.
It's a sorry tale, isn't it?
Yeah,
really.
yes.
And I remember obviously, I don't remember my grandmother saying this. She tried very hard to dissuade Julian Bell from going out to the Spanish Civil War. But I do remember a conversation I had years later with another uncle of mine, David Garnett, who told me that he had talked to Julian Bell before he went and said, don't go to the Spanish Civil War, not because you'll die, but because there's another bigger war coming. You're wasting your time on this one. This is a sideshow.
Well, they sort of thought that what they'd learn in Spain would be useful for the next war. And one of the people I write about, Tom Wintringham, who was in the Communist Party of Great Britain, he would then be involved in setting up and organising the Home Guard in 1940, so was able to use his skills, having commanded the British battalion of the International Brigades, then was able to then use that experience in a useful way, having survived, despite being shot a number of times.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think your writers have to offer us about war itself in terms of their insights, Lara? I mean, some seriously good books came out from your group of writers. Do you think they tell us more about the writers themselves, or do you think your writers have... we're talking about specifically wartime writing?
I think we are talking about specifically wartime writing. I don't think it tells... I think they're... All of them wrote journalism of one kind or another, which I think tells us a lot about that war and about... Bowen's great on this sort of moment of democracy, the People's War that briefly develops in the autumn of 1940s. She sort of doesn't overdo it, but she does say that suddenly the effort to groom starts with the effort to brush dust from the hair, that everyone is sort of is much more equal. And she never quite sort of buys into that idea of sort of suddenly we really are equal, but she documents that moment well. I think they all have that. I think the novels, it's more that sort of lucid abnormality that I quoted at the beginning, that it's the peculiar charged atmosphere of that war that comes across in the novels. And
when you read The End of the Affair,
The End of the Affair, or
The Heat of the
Court, or The Heat of the Day, which are all wonderful novels, and often the most sort of sensual and kind of lyrical novels that those writers wrote. I mean, they all seem, I think, like anomalies in some ways in the general work, and I think that comes from that sense that we might die tomorrow and the kind of intensity that evokes. So I think it's a sort of a bleak angle on war, but it nonetheless does tell us something about one aspect of the war experience.
The writer you made me want to go off and read, or the book you made me want to go off and read, is the one about Ruins by Rose Macaulay.
Yes.
Because I think your description of her sense of what ruined buildings and bomb sites can do, absolutely fascinating.
And it's a personal quest. So Gerald O'Donovan does die a year later, and Macaulay's flat is bombed. So Macaulay's flat is bombed in 1941, and she loses all his letters, which is kind of, at that point she really gives up.
It's a wonderful description in the book.
She's and of course at this point she can't tell anyone why she's so sort of just devastated by the loss of her flat. So she writes articles about losing her books when really she's half talking about the letters. Then he dies, and she says, "I wish I'd been bombed too." She wants to give up, but somehow has to keep going. And so what she does is to go round the ruins of the world, writing this growing and growing, sort of spiralling out of control book called The Pleasure of Ruins, in which she's hoping that she can find that sort of older ruins have a sort of melancholy pleasure about them because they tell us that these awful times will pass. And so by surveying the ruins of the world, she sort of reminds herself that her awful time too will pass, and that one day we'll look back on the Second World War ruins and see them as sort of beautiful monuments to a lost time, and won't know about that moment-to-moment awfulness, and it sort of works for her.
And you bring the book into the post-war as you discuss that, which actually is almost like a whole other episode of tying up loose ends.
There is quite a lot of post-war after.
Yes.
It's hard to let
Well,
them
no,
go.
it's hard to let go. I found the same with my book. David, just this is really a last question because I think we should open it up. But as we just mentioned, the Spanish Civil War was, as it were, I think in many people's eyes, a dress rehearsal for the Second World War. And I just wondered whether you had any thoughts when you were writing this, whether you were writing a book now about the Spanish Civil War because of other more important, relevant contemporary questions that it raised, questions about intervention, questions about appeasement. It did strike me that there's a lot of very contemporary resonances going on here.
Well, there were when I was writing it particularly, and now when I was writing it, the Libyan conflict was going on.
Yeah.
I'd be listening to the news and they'd be talking about rebels doing this and that, and
Yes.
writing about rebels in my book, and then with what's happening in Syria now. Someone mentioned it on Radio 4 just last week, saying, about whether we should intervene or not there, and saying, and this chap was saying that, civil wars they can explode into bigger wars. Look what happened with the Spanish Civil War and then the Second World War, which I felt sort of missed the point really of the involvement in the Spanish Civil War. Whether we didn't get involved, then allowed the Second World War to happen. And Orwell and Hemingway were thinking, well, if we do something now against fascism in Spain, we'll stop another war, rather than the fact that we didn't get involved, or had got involved, it would have caused it. This all seems a bit back to front, but yeah, there's certainly plenty of resonance, and the question of intervention is absolutely still very, very relevant.
A whole other question, how many masterpieces would come out of an intervention to a Middle Eastern conflict today? That remains to be seen. Let's open it up to the floor. We have some roving mics. And do I have a question? Yes, I do. Over, gentleman on the left. Thank you.
I'd like to ask Lara about the fifth person in the Blitz and the role of that person in the structure of her book.
The role of
The fifth. There were five, weren't there?
Oh, so Hilda Steele. Yes, absolutely. So Hilda Steele was at home in Wimbledon for that particular night. So the final chapter is the All Clear chapter, where we look at her. And she is the only one of my writers who has children in London. She has a small daughter. And so her sense of vulnerability is that she's not able to have that sort of invincibility, I think, that the others who were sort of briefly single had. She and her husband emigrated. They're sort of well connected in literary London. They both write in English. They're not sort of refugees, but they nonetheless have left behind kind of vibrant lives for her in Vienna, and found this sort of slightly, she hates Wimbledon. She calls it a green grave, where she's trapped away from sort of the centre of things. And she finds it exhausting. She doesn't go to the shelters. She drowns out the noise of the bombs with music on the gramophone and puts mattresses against the wall. And her husband, Peter de Mendelssohn, is having a lot more fun than she is, and she's a bit resentful about that because
They always are, aren't they?
Yes, they are. But the great thing about Hilda Steele, which is part of her role in the book, is that after the war, her situation sort of reverses, and suddenly the others, or Bowen and Greene particularly, find it terribly anticlimactic at the end of the war, that they don't quite know what to do in this depressing country that is post-war Britain. And Hilda Steele is sent back as an English foreign correspondent to Vienna, and finds the same sort of sense of intensity and seizing the day sort of atmosphere, I suppose, that they'd found in London, in post-war Vienna. And she suddenly has her sort of brief moment of wartime adultery after the war in Vienna. And she's there at the same time as Graham Greene is there making The Third Man, and Elizabeth Bowen is there on a lecture tour for the British Council. So there's this sort of odd confluence of them in post-war Vienna. And she then goes to post-war Germany, and I follow her there briefly as well. And so I like the fact that she's a reminder of how awful and tedious and sort of involving queuing for endlessly at sort of fishmongers the war is, but then of how there are sort of alternative post-war stories, I suppose.
Yes, a lady over here. Have a mic. And does anyone after that, just so that we can have a mic ready?
Until the last few comments, I felt rather somewhat disappointed. Sorry? No. Because I'd always thought of the British and American and others who went to fight for the Republican side in the Spanish Civil War really to be the one moment when thinkers went for a cause. They really did want to fight fascism, whereas you have drawn out that they felt disappointed that they weren't able to be heroic in the First World War, and they were going for more, perhaps, selfish reasons. And I just like to know what you feel about the idea of idealism.
They went for very many reasons. You can't.
Yeah.
One couldn't say they all went for one reason. Some went. Orwell states specifically that he felt, as I said, less of a man for having missed the First World War and wanted to go and prove himself. And that was a very, very conscious thing. Esmond Romilly, who was 17, 18, he knew very much of the experience of the war, yet he refused to join and participate in the officer training corps at his public school because he was against the idea of war. And there were idealistic reasons, there were romantic reasons, there were all sorts of reasons. The British battalion of the International Brigades was made up of a vast mix of men who were there for all manner of reasons, from 15 and 16-year-olds to 50 and 60-year-olds. The press back in Britain was disparaging of a lot of them and saying they're men who've been promised lots of money to go and fight. They're just mercenaries. They're destitute. They're poor. They're alcoholics or whatever. Certainly, some of them were that type of person. And Tom Winteringham, I mentioned, who ended up commanding the battalion the first time it went into action, said that called them a rabble, and there were all types there. Some who'd never fired a gun before, got almost no training before they went into action. And that's part of the horror and the shambles that Virginia was talking about, that some of the chaps who came out from New York, for example, they arrived the first time the American battalion went into action for the first time in 1937, and they'd had no training. They were still in the clothes they came out from, and were virtually ordered to go over the top in an attack which, as certain members said, the generals we've got, many of them were coming from the Red Army, were using World War I tactics in 1936 and 1937, and were just sending men over the top in trenches against machine guns to be mown down. And that was what Orwell encountered as well. They couldn't believe sort of the situation they'd got themselves into. And it was partly the fault of the democracies, like Britain, particularly in France and America, who refused to allow the Spanish Republican Army to buy weapons on the open market, which, as a democratic country, they would normally have been entitled to do. So they were fighting the Republicans, particularly, with an assortment of weapons bought on the back market or sent over by the Russians, and had all manner of weapons of all type and ages, and no significant training. And that's where the idealism, a lot of it, or some of it, died. But then a lot of the men who came back to Britain, particularly, said they would do it again, and were very proud of what they'd done and to have been there, and felt that they had done something significant and important, and were willing to do it again and to die for that cause.
Do we have anyone else? Yes, there's one, and then could you get a mic to the gentleman?
Can I ask David as well? I mean, virtually all the writers and intellectuals we know about went to fight for the Republican side, but were there any who went to fight for the nationalists? There
were plenty of foreigners who did go to fight for the nationalists, but none significant as writers or intellectuals or subsequent writers. No, there were writers back at home in the UK and America who sided with Franco either for religious reasons or purely political reasons, but not not the big names. No, and I think if what's interesting is why the writers, why these writers went in the first place. And Virginia asked at the end the last question about whether this book has sort of contemporary resonance, and if there was intervention, would writers go? I mean, would big name, would sort of Martin Amis or someone, or the younger generation of writers, would they go and get themselves involved? I think.
Big question, yes. There was a gentleman further forward, yes, and had his hand up. Thank you.
I believe, David, there were many atrocities during the Spanish Civil War, Spaniard on Spaniard, because they held different views. Were your writers aware of this sort of activity, and did it affect their views of the war?
They were aware to some extent. Some of them were more aware than others. It's difficult to say because partly they didn't want to tarnish the name of the Republic by reporting on atrocities that had occurred. The famous incident that I write about in the book is John dos Passos, Ernest Hemingway's friend, whose friend and Spanish translator who translated Dos Passos' novels into Spanish was killed by the security forces, and he had a big falling out with Hemingway over this because he wanted to report and tell the truth of what was happening in Spain when he returned to America. And Hemingway said, well, look, if you do that, you're going to be betraying the cause. And likewise, Orwell wanted to write about what was happening, and particularly the May events in Barcelona in 1937, and he found it difficult initially getting a publisher. The New Statesman, for example, wouldn't publish his account of what had happened in Barcelona when three factions in the Republican side of the war were fighting against each other. And
this is the book that became Homage to Catalonia.
Yes, but it was initially rejected by his publisher. Yeah. So I think there was an extent to which they did know, definitely, and there would have been atrocities happening probably, in front of their eyes, the ones who went into the front line. But then there were atrocities happening behind the front line. The anarchists in Barcelona, for example, were killing plenty of people when, for example, the Spanish Medical Aid, the organisation sent out to provide ambulances, in which Julian Bell was working for when he was killed. They were well aware of what was happening around them, but they felt that it was best not to report on those things because it would undermine the cause. And the show trials in Moscow were going on at exactly the same time, and the left in Britain was not wanting to comment on those or query them or question them for that fear, because the Communist Party seemed to be the organisation that was really standing up to the threat of fascism, and that was it was felt that was the greater threat, and that these awful things were happening had to be sort of hidden and swept under the carpet whilst the fight was to be fought.
And you get Virginia Woolf's account of those awful photographs of the dead children, don't you? Which I think must have been one of the first kind of the first sort of general press releases in Britain of sort of photographs of what was happening in Spain.
I think we have a question over there.
I don't know, I'll press this thing. For David, but just on those big names who were possibly fascist thinkers in the 30s, and two characters that are in your first book, I was just thinking of Ezra Pound and Percy Wyndham Lewis. They were both, how did they fit in with the Spanish Civil War? Because they were both sort of supporters of fascism, weren't they, in the 30s?
Wyndham Lewis wrote a book called Hitler in 1935 and 1936, saying that he saw Hitler as the way ahead. But Pound I don't discuss at all, but Wyndham Lewis I do in that, as someone who's got an attitude on a position on Hitler, and to give some sense that many people thought that the British government and certainly the upper class were very pro-Franco, and that the Foreign Office and the Royal Navy particularly were lending their assistance covertly to to Franco. And I wanted to give some sense of why that was the case, and why there was a pro-fascist element, and quite a strong pro-fascist element in Britain at that time. And Hitler expected Britain to be sort of siding with his regime, because he saw himself as the bulwark against communism, and that communism was the greater threat, and that was what the upper classes had to fear. There'd been a big general strike in 1926. There was a burgeoning communist movement in Britain, small but increasing. That threat of a revolution in Britain was the greater fear, and the Soviet Union was the great enemy, not fascism.
Actually, Lara, it might be quite interesting here to come in about the reactions of some of your writers, particularly I was thinking Elizabeth Bowen, who felt terribly betrayed by the Labour victory in 1945, didn't it? And so this right-wing element is kind of creeping into some of your people as well.
Yes, I mean, I think they certainly weren't pro-fascist in any way. I think
I wasn't trying to imply that.
It was just I think Bowen sort of, she wrote that essay really meaning it about we're now a democracy, we're almost a commune, she said. But Charles Ritchie always said that Elizabeth could get hold of unheard of quantities of smoked salmon throughout the war. And so there was this sort of other side of it. And the Labour victory, I think it was partly that Charles had just left for Canada, and she was so she, in a way, a bit like Mcauley, needed something to throw her sorrow and distress into. So she described herself as being physically sick after the news of the Labour victory came. And I think it wasn't just about the Labour victory, but it was she felt it was it was almost a bit distasteful, the ease with which people had needed Churchill and then got rid of him. So I think it was partly how it happened. Certainly, I think Henry Yorke, most of all, was just furious about the new taxes, and that it was all very well sort of working side by side with kind of the working classes, but you didn't actually want to fund them. And so there was that sort of uncomfortableness with...
I'd love to get you also just to comment, Lara, a little bit about your research for this, because it's an extraordinarily densely researched book, and the sources are extraordinary. Where did you go for all that material?
Yeah, I mean, I guess we must have had similar processes.
You both did. But
yeah,
if you could, I suppose because I've been working on the Second World War as well.
So initially the 5 writers' archives, and then to reconstruct the sort of hour by hour stuff.
That's what I felt.
Metropolitan Archives.
The immediacy of it.
Yeah. The Second World War records, I'm sure you found, are quite a mess in that it's hard, that you sort of have to go to the fire service record to get one side of where was bombed when, but they might not tell you the time, so then you have to go to the local borough archive and find out sort of...
I don't think I did as much as you.
So it was every borough archive and the London Metropolitan Archive, and then the sort of individual services archives and the national archives, and between them you can kind of
piece it all together. It's quite a jigsaw puzzle, isn't it?
And I think there's now that wonderful website, bomb site, that's trying to do that, that's trying to work out that's sort of mapping every incident of bombing in the Blitz and trying to get the timing, because it's quite hard to do.
What did we do before the internet? Yes. One last question. Yes, the lady here.
I'm sure that looking round, there are a number of us who share an experience of growing up in the 50s and 60s and living with the silence, particularly of men who had who were involved in both wars. And I wanted to ask all three of you if you could account for whether you think that silence and the way that stories were hidden from people accounts or goes some way towards accounting for the incredible interest now in both the 30s and the Spanish Civil War and
this might be a question for you,
War.
because you've done so much more work on the sort of ordinary experiences.
Yes, I suppose there is an element of silence. I have to say a lot of my work is actually interview-based, but I talk to the women, not the men. And I think the women, I tend to find what my children call my old ladies, are only too happy to be regarded as human archives and are very, very happy to talk on the whole about their memories. And I've had that experience of great willingness to remember and to recall and to dredge up all manner of reminiscences. And that to me is, is the gold mine which I do my research on. I don't do as much archive research as you. I tend, because my background's in television, I'm more of a reporter, if you like, a documentarist. But I think, actually, yes, you probably do have a point, is that I think you've more or less implied it yourself, that a great many people who lived through wars found their experiences literally unspeakable and couldn't talk about it and couldn't share it. It was certainly the case after the First World War.
I think more the case, yes, after the First War. My experience, I think my interest in this period has come from my father, who talked about it, and that experience of his experience of having grown up in London through the war certainly fired my interest and my imagination. And then my grandfather, who served in the Second World War, talked about it a lot. So I think for him it was the great period of his youth, and he'd have many anecdotes about it.
Lara?
I suppose certainly the war in London, there wasn't that. I mean, I think the thing with the First World War was that these people had gone off and had sort of experiences that no one could imagine because they hadn't seen it. The war in London was a much more, everyone was there, the war generally in Britain, that there wasn't a need to sort of conjure the atmosphere because everyone had had it, so it was easier to share experiences. Like maybe it's more a coming back from overseas thing, but again, it was because there was complete mobilisation. I think I haven't come across many sort of silences. I agree.
Total war.
Yeah.
Second World War.
Yeah.
I think we better end it there. And thank you very much. 2 fascinating books.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much for talking so stirringly and evocatively about the Spanish Civil War and the Blitz in London. And thank you so much, Virginia, for asking such thought-provoking questions. I'm going to do the usual thing and ask you to sit down for a little bit while we take David and Lara to the bookstall, where I expect they'll be happy to sign some books. Thank you both very much.